YouTube. Indications green, excellent connection. The meeting is yours, Mr. Chair. Let me know if you need anything.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order, the meeting of the regular meeting. Got it. The regular meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. I'll call the meeting to order at 7:30. And may we please do the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance
to the
flag
of the
United States of America,
and
and to the republic
public
for which it
stands,
one nation,
one nation,
under God,
indivisible,
with liberty
and justice for all.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. May I have roll call, please?
Mr. Georges.
Here.
And also, just as a reminder, hopefully last time, state where you are.
Boston, Michigan, Oakland County.
Mr. Casero.
Here in Clawson, Michigan.
Mr. McHale.
Here in Clawson, Michigan, Oakland County, zip 48017.
Mr. Nushai.
Here in Troy, Oakland County, Michigan.
Mr. Pernick.
Here in Clawson, Oakland County, Michigan.
Miss Redmond.
Here, Clawson, Michigan.
Mr. Sanaki.
Here, Clawson, Michigan, Oakland County.
Mr. Shepard. And Mr. Watson. All right, thank you.
Okay, thank you. We move on to agenda item number 4. Unfortunately, I don't think we can approve the regular minute meetings from June 8th, as I didn't see a copy of that in my packet. Did anyone else get that? Or
I believe
Nick,
they were sent.
Nick could, no.
They were sent separately because they weren't available when I sent the packet out. So I believe they came directly from Joan.
Oh, I didn't see that one. So
yeah, they were mailed the following day, emailed the following day. Mm-hmm.
Oh.
Okay, I saw Joan had sent something out. I picked up my copy from Nick at the office.
Okay, so if enough members have seen it, does anyone want to make a vote that we approve it?
I'll make a motion that we approve the minutes of the meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, June 8th, 2021.
Support.
A motion and support. Any problems or any comments on it? Seeing none, we'll approve it as is. Roll call, please.
Mr. Georges.
Yes.
Mr. Kucera.
Yes.
Mr. McHale.
Yes.
Mr. Nushai.
Yes.
Mr. Pernick.
Yes.
Ms. Redmond.
Yes.
Mr. Sanaki.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Carried. Agenda item number 5, public discussion. We need some help with this one to open it up to the public.
Yes, Mr. Chair. It appears there are no public online at this time.
We're not drawing an audience, eh?
It might be early for them.
Okay. If there's no one there from public, I will close public discussion. And we will move on to other business. And under the other business, our first item is zoning ordinance amendments, EFS.
I don't have anything in the presentation for this, so I'll stop the share so that we're looking at each other instead of the screen, which is the agenda on it. So this was, we discussed this last time. Got some clarification on what we're looking for. And I have made a couple of changes to the if we're okay with this, then I would work on the first version of the building material guidelines to present to you next time. They're the end of page 2 of that memo. Item 3 has been expanded based on our last discussion, and it refers to building material guidelines. I will prepare that if you're okay with this language, and we can look at it next time in concert with the language.
Excuse me, have there been changes made since our last discussion here?
Yes, yeah. Item 3 in particular was a shorter sentence referring just to EFS. There was some discussion of aluminum siding is similar in character in terms of its durability at ground level. So I actually added that and just put the rationale in there as Commissioner Sanaki was discussing. Then I added a little thing saying the city shall maintain and from time to time amend building material guidelines, including a list of materials not to be used at ground floor level. And as I said, I haven't prepared that document yet, but if you're okay with this, basic language, even with a tweak or two, I'll prepare that document and we can look at it in concert with the language at a future meeting.
Very good. Anyone have any comments on this? Ed, are you pleased with your addition?
Yes, and I don't know if we need a motion, but if you're ready, I would make a motion that we instruct the planner to finalize this and prepare it for our approval and then forward to the council.
And would that require a motion, or do we just pass this on to?
Yeah, you would need a motion for that. Yep. So I would go for a second on that.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion. I have a second. Any other comments? Any other changes to be made to it? Everyone's pleased the way that it is. Can I have roll call, please?
Mr. Nushai,
Yeah.
Mr. Pernick,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond,
yes,
Mr. Sanaki,
Yes.
Mr. Georges,
Yes.
Mr. Kucera,
Yes.
Mr. McHale.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Thank you. Agenda item number 6B. We're now moving on to zoning ordinance amendments. Medical marijuana primary caregivers.
Right. So we've talked quite a bit about marijuana uses recently. However, we haven't talked about the marijuana uses we already have in our community, which, and every community in Michigan, with the possible exception of, what is it, Gress Township that only has 10 people in it, has primary caregivers. This law was enacted in 2008 on the basis of a referendum, and it allowed for individuals to grow for themselves and up to 5 patients if they're properly registered with the state. And the way the state law is written, they can't be zoned out. So we have to have some way that they're permitted. I've given you this this memo that kind of gives you the background on it, and I can go through as much of this as you need me to, but kind of the light version of what prompted this discussion is, well, we're talking about the other marijuana uses anyway, and our zoning ordinance does not address these uses at all at the moment. But also we've had a number of inquiries over the last year, but increasing in frequency in the last couple of months, about establishing primary caregiver operations in commercial buildings or industrial buildings, particularly over in the Rochester corridor. And the intent of at least one or two of those people who's been inquiring seems to be that they would acquire a building and then they would lease out spaces in that building to individual primary caregivers to grow their product. And that's actually illegal right now, because we don't have anything in the zoning ordinance saying otherwise. We wanted to have a discussion about how we feel like we should be dealing with these primary caregivers as the overall environment around cannabis changes in the state and in the city and in our surrounding communities as well. We don't have any language for you to look at tonight. We wanted to have the discussion first, and then we can put together an ordinance pretty quickly. We've done this for several communities, so we've got language lying around basically, and it's all been legally, vetted. So we're in pretty good shape as far as that's concerned. We're confident we can come up with something fairly quickly. But basically, just to give you an idea of what a registered primary caregiver can do. So they can grow up to 12 plants per patient, and they can serve a maximum of 5 patients, plus they can grow for themselves. So that means they can grow up to 72 plants as part of their operation. And per state law, they have to be grown in an enclosed, locked facility that's defined in the statute. And the state law doesn't permit us to prohibit registered primary caregivers, but it does allow us to regulate them. A lot of communities initially, either they took no action or they made them home occupations, basically to keep them out of sight. So you can grow these plants in your house, and you have to meet all the standards of a home occupation, which is that there are no exterior changes to the house or the property. You don't have hazardous chemicals. You don't have employees. It's just you. And that's how most of the primary caregivers who are in the city are operating. And back in, it's just last year, actually. It seems like a lot longer than that, but it's been that kind of year. The Michigan Supreme Court issued a decision in a case called DeRuyter versus Township of Byron. And they found that the Michigan Medical Marijuana Act doesn't nullify a municipality's authority to regulate land use under the Zoning Enabling Act, as long as you're not actually prohibiting marijuana cultivation by a registered primary caregiver. And you can't impose regulations that are inconsistent with state law, but that applies everywhere. So when we're thinking about this issue, I guess we have a couple of things to think about. One is, we have to think about caregivers in neighborhoods. So right now, most of our caregiver operations are located in homes. It's the case in most communities. There are some potential safety and health issues associated with these operations in homes. Mold is one of them. High levels of water and electricity consumption is another thing to think about. And until recently, DTE was getting lots of requests for service upgrades to, a standard service is 100 amps. Lots of houses have 200 amps, particularly if you have a larger home. But people were asking for 800 amp services, just way, way above what's normal for a residence. And DTE has kind of cracked down on that recently because it's causing problems for their grid. And it was actually causing, particularly in rural communities, we're having problems with brownouts because you'd get a couple of these things in one area and they just were sucking so much power that it was causing problems. And so there's that issue to think about. There's also, other, like there's certain extraction methods for the oils and this stuff that can be a fire hazard. So there are a few things like that to think about when you're thinking about these things occurring in homes. Another thing to think about is that because we don't have a regulation that says that you have to be the operator of this caregiver operation has to be the owner or the resident of the home. Someone could potentially buy a home and just use it for the caregiver operation, and not live in it. There could be nobody living in there. So you've got a home on a street. It's got no one living in it, and it's just being used for this. And this happens around the state. We know of a few examples just, in our own lives. And that can ultimately, if you get more than one of those on a street, that can start to harm a block. Because they're houses, you want people living in them, right? When we think about caregivers in non-residential districts, locating caregivers entirely in non-residential districts can relieve some of those issues that are caused, by having them in neighborhoods, but it can lead to other things, like you could have your commercial and industrial property, which is, more expensive. It has a higher taxable value. A single caregiver probably isn't going to be able to swing operating in an industrial or commercial property on their own. And you're probably going to have a situation where you have multiple caregivers getting together to establish multiple operations in one place. And it becomes basically a de facto grow operation, because if you get 5 or 6 of these caregivers, each with their 72 plants, suddenly you've got many, many, many plants, and you're approaching the scale of the grow operations that are permitted under the other marijuana laws that we're talking about in our other discussion. We're not really so much talking about the medical marijuana law anymore, because since the recreational stuff became legal, nobody's really going through the medical process anymore, because you can just do it through the recreational. There are certain standards about purity and testing that the medical still requires if you're distributing it that way. But hopefully one day we'll get to a point where we just have one law that we're dealing with, but we seem to be a long way from that. And then the other thing to think about is on-site distribution. So in the absence of local regulation, caregivers can distribute their product to their registered patients on site, which means that you could have people coming up to someone's house multiple times a day to, buy this product. And a lot of communities that have put regulations in place have actually prohibited on-site distribution. You've got to distribute it elsewhere just for that very reason. Because the thing is, you can have up to 5 patients, but if you're growing a surplus, not everybody plays by the rules necessarily. So you might kind of wind up with more than 5 people coming to that property.
Hey, Joe, can I ask a question here
Sure.
real quick? I don't know. So they don't have to use the transporter type of regulation in that then?
No, the businesses permitted under the other 2 laws have to use secure transporters to move their product from one location to another. So if you're a grower, you have to use a secure transporter to move it to a processor. And if you're a processor, you have to use a secure transporter to move it to a dispensary. But in this case, no, it's direct distribution, and you are not required to use a secure transporter. And that's actually a very good question, though. Just as a side note, under the most recent law, anybody is allowed to grow plants for themselves. I think it's the same number. I think it's up to 12. There's probably a lot of people now growing them for themselves. But caregivers are still very much a part of the cannabis ecosystem in Michigan. So when we get to the discussion portion of this memo, I've kind of put a bunch of topics out there for you all to think about. One is where to permit caregivers? This is probably the most fundamental question that we need to discuss and decide something on. Right now, they're permitted everywhere just by the fact that we don't have any regulation on their location. Where do we think that they're most appropriately located? Obviously, other cannabis-related uses might be coming to the city following the November election. And we're working on regulations for that in a separate conversation. And those, of course, would come to non-residential areas in the city. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how many caregivers should be permitted on a property. So if the use is permitted in the R districts, R1 and R2, would we want to limit it to one caregiver per property, or maybe two if more than one residence licensed? Caregivers growing in an R district really should be owner occupants of the home on the property. On properties with non-residential zoning, you'd likely need more than one caregiver in order to avoid a de facto prohibition, because the one caregiver is probably going to have trouble getting their hands on that commercial building for such a small operation. So unless you're allowing some sort of condo type situation where people have leased units in which they're conducting their operations, most likely you're not going to be creating a situation in which a primary caregiver can effectively operate. If you just put it all in the commercial districts without allowing for more than one caregiver. But you can consider how many it might be reasonable to allow to occupy a given property. And it might not necessarily be a hard and fast number. It could be based on the size of the property or the size of the building too. And then also, whether you want some separation between caregivers or if you kind of prefer to have them more aggregated in one place. So there's kind of a lot to think about in terms of the number of caregivers, and it's sort of dependent on your answer to the first question. Where are we going to permit them?
Hey, Joe, I have a question. I don't know if I can insert here or not.
Sure, yeah.
Would you rather? Yeah.
No,
Okay.
go, throw your questions out while you're thinking of them.
Okay. Are they, do they have to adhere to the same regulations in terms of disassembling and dismantling those areas of their home that they grow in as a regular facility? I know that there's strict regulations on how to remediate and clean those homes.
Mm-mm. No.
Yeah, there's really
No.
nothing. There's
No.
really nothing for the primary caregivers. It's
So if we had 3 in a home and it grew mold, there would be no like
Right.
steps and regulatory process to
Right.
that. Okay.
Yeah, and that's really one of the challenges that communities have been facing and dealing with after this legislation went through, and not just with things like mold and the house structure itself with conditions, but other external impacts like odor, primarily. And then, as Joe was pointing out, sometimes energy and water usage as well can impact neighboring homes. But for a long time, as Joe said, really until the DeRuyter case last year, communities felt like they really didn't have any way to control it. They just had to sort of manage along the best they could. But this has been, I think, a good decision by the Michigan Supreme Court to say, no, this may not be appropriate in all locations. And as long as you're providing for it and providing reasonable regulations for it, then communities are able to do that through zoning.
right.
Now we can regulations in terms of getting that house back to a, I mean, I've walked through homes where I know there's been a growth. I mean, there's other signs
Yeah.
as well, but it's like, smell it when you walk in the door, and then, at the back of the home, you're like, oh, that's where that smell is coming. Like, there aren't regulations that we can impose as a city to remediate those homes after.
I think it's just a matter of property management, and if somebody sells a home, they obviously have to disclose all that. That's, I guess, on your end, really, if you see that people would be, providing for that in some way with pricing or giving allowances for improvements. Certainly it can't be uninhabitable. If there is a point at which, when a home is not able to be used for habitation because of, filth or significant issues, then certainly the city can go in and investigate that. But just as a general rule, just to inspect, no.
Right. So actually, and that kind of plays into the next item in the memo, which is, growing operations are going to occur indoors in a community like Clawson. It doesn't have vast expanses of land where you could grow outside. So it's going to be an indoor operation. In a non-residential district, that would occur in a principal building on the lot. In our districts, it's happening in the home right now. I have one community that recently just moved these primarily to an industrial district, but they did allow it, and they're more of an agricultural community. They did allow it to continue in their larger lot residential districts, but it had to move into the accessory structures to avoid the issues of potential health issues that it can create in a principal structure of the home. So that's another thing to consider, is if it's going to still be on residential property, should it be in the home? And of course, there's expense related to setting up an accessory building that meets the state standards for an enclosed lock facility and is going to be adequate to the job of growing these things year round. It's going to have to be insulated, for instance. But nevertheless, the potential health implications of growing it in the house suggest that putting it in an accessory building might actually be a better solution in a residential district. Next topic here is permitting and inspection. So they're not licensed by the city. We could consider requiring a certificate of zoning compliance or other form of registration. Some communities are doing that now. That hasn't been tested, I will say, in the courts. So a lot of communities are doing it, but it's something to think about in terms of, how we want to handle it. Furthermore, all improvements made to a property to facilitate a caregiver growing operation should be subject to permitting and inspection. That's sort of a normal in the course of doing business thing. If you're adding air conditioning units or, you're doing electrical work on your house, you should be getting permits and inspections for that, regardless of why you're doing it. But we do want to be thinking about that as well. And then, let's say that we say these uses have to move to industrial districts and, BRD2 or something. Let's just pulling the names of districts out of the air. Caregivers technically then are not permitted in the residential districts anymore. However, if you have a legally established caregiver use in an R district, they're going to be a non-conforming use now, and they will be allowed to continue that use in that R district. So we definitely need to be mindful of that. Obviously, if it wasn't a legally established operation in the first place, it's still going to be subject to enforcement. But, if we did want to have existing caregivers, registering with the city, we'd probably need a separate licensing ordinance that would work in concert with the zoning regulations, so that we could kind of capture everybody, because zoning is not retroactively applicable. So you would have a situation where you had all the new people registering, but the non-conformities would not necessarily need to register.
Now, Joe, would transferable then?
What's that?
Would those be transferable then? For, let's say, someone at 57, whatever, would they be able to convey that license? Is that license transferable? That caregiver, if it was a or once it transfers, that opens them up to as if they were getting a new sign, new regulation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very good
No.
question. So,
And I can jump in, generally not.
yeah,
And for primary caregivers, they're not, they don't get a license through the state. They're registered with the state. So it's a little bit different than the other facilities that we talked about, we've been talking about. So in this case, they would just have to go through the, essentially the site plan review process, because if the recommendation is that they would go into non-residential districts, then any non-residential use would require site plan review. And that's the way that you can then start to do some regulation in terms of, making sure that there's an inspection that covers the humidity levels and that covers odor and waste and all the things that we think are negative impacts that should be managed. And then that would not be transferable. Once it's approved for one location, that's it.
yeah.
Well, that's the thing for one location. So that location, if it transferred owners or was leased out, would the new or lease that moved into that property, it could be a, hot commodity, like it could be used in that way. Would that say I had my residence, established as that, would I be able to lease that residence out to someone who maybe wants to use it as that? Or
currently, yes.
Currently, yes. Okay.
Currently, yeah. As far as, could it be continued as a non-conforming use, just like any other non-conforming use if someone else took over the house and it wasn't permitted in the R district anymore? I think that's what you're getting at, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, non-conforming uses generally can be continued, as long as there's no, change or expansion to those non-conforming uses. Yeah, typically they can be continued. So unless you have some other system in place.
Right. And we can confirm and discuss that further with the city attorney.
Yeah, and if you're licensing people through the city, the new provider would have to get a license. You're probably going to make that an annual renewal if you're going to license people.
I have a question.
Sure.
The state has certain regulations in place, like, you have the doors have to be locked. What else do they have, and what do they regulate as far as odor?
Not much.
No?
Hardly
No.
anything, in fact.
So that would be on the city to do that?
Yeah,
That would be
it's exactly. It's they require it to be grown in an enclosed locked facility, and they define what an enclosed locked facility is. Otherwise, it's pretty wide open.
Okay.
There's very little in the way of requirements. Even for basic things like ventilation, it's just it's very, very sketchy. There's just not much in the law that specifies what you have to do as part of this operation.
If you had multiple caregivers growing in a industrial site, we don't have control over odor. Is there a certain fire restriction? I mean,
if you were gonna move this to industrial areas, you would have everything would be subject to inspections, and you could have all the fire inspections and all your performance standards apply to any new use in an industrial district. And I'm just saying industrial as an example of the type of district you might be looking at, but
not residential.
Yeah, moving it to a non-residential district gives us a lot more that we can do. Once it's not a home occupation anymore, there's a lot we can look at in terms of standards.
And does the state do inspections occasionally to ensure that these are they're staying to the number of plants or any of that, or would that be something then that would be up to the city to do with their inspections once a year?
City can regulate and inspect, or the city can inspect things that it regulates. But
Yep.
if it's related to the license or registration and the state act for that's up to the state to enforce. The city can't enforce that.
Okay.
Yeah, and the state, to my understanding, does not really go around inspecting all of these
Right.
hundreds of caregiver operations. I've not heard of the state inspecting one. It's possible that they do occasionally, but I have not heard of them inspecting any of these operations.
The city would inspect the site for conditions.
Mhm.
If we wanted to do that. Okay.
Yeah.
So to piggyback that, in a little bit of, just in a little bit of searching I've done online, and again, this is not, I don't know if this is factual, but is there a liability, and maybe this is not for you, Joe, is there a liability that the city takes on? Because from what I read, that once you go above a certain number of plants, it's not like, it can become a federal law that is breached versus a state law. And I know I'm not explaining it as well as like the Google that I've read, but do you know what I'm alluding to? That there are a certain number of plants that the federal laws won't touch. And then once you get, let's say you stack like 3 caregivers, that then encroaches onto a federal thing that federal law can then come in and impose. And I'm wondering if we did, put this in place for, let's say, an industrial district, does that open up the city for any type of legal issue? Does that make sense?
It's a good question for the city attorney. One thing I will say is that most of the regulations that you'll see in zoning ordinances do include a disclaimer in the intent statement that notes that it's still prohibited under federal law, and that, these regulations should not be construed as permission to act out of accord with federal law. Let me see if I got an example here. I've got a couple ordinances up. Let's see.
That is a common thing to add in. And I think Joe's right. I think that's a good question for the city attorney as well.
Yeah, and we'll definitely be discussing these with him. So like, for instance, this one ordinance that I've got here says, let's see, nothing in this section or in any other regulatory provision is intended to grant, nor shall they be construed as granting, immunity from criminal prosecution for growing, sale, consumption, use, distribution, or possession of marijuana, not in strict compliance with the Act and its general rules. Also, since federal law is not affected by the Act or its general rules, nothing in this section or in any other regulatory provision of in this case, it's the township, is intended to grant, nor shall they be construed as granting immunity from criminal prosecution under federal law. The MMMA does not protect users, caregivers, or other owners of properties on which the medical use of marijuana is occurring from federal prosecution or from having their property seized by federal authorities under the Federal Controlled Substances Act. There's a paragraph like that in pretty much every set of caregiver regulations, and that's why. Your question is why. It's you're telling people right in the ordinance, look, this is still not compliant with federal law, and that's not on us, it's on you. So definitely it's something that we'll be discussing with your attorney, but that is the kind of clause that would be in your ordinance to cover that.
Yeah, I'd like to see more legal input on this. It's one thing, we've been discussing dispensaries in the past, and that's a difficult enough subject, but at least with that, I can get my head around it, that we can outlaw where they can and can't go because of school zones and things. This caregivers in a house, it's like homemade bathroom gin to me. I mean, anybody can grow a plant, and there's really probably no quality control over what the product is, what they're growing, what they're producing. It's a pretty scary subject, I think.
And that's why the DeRuyter case was so important last year, because up until then, communities were told or were operating under the presumption that they couldn't do anything about it.
Right.
And so it's a problem in some communities. It's not really a big problem in others. There may be homes on your street that are doing this, and you may not realize it. Or you might walk down the street and smell very strong odors and know that one of the houses around there is obviously doing that. Sometimes it's, hard to know it's a problem until it's a problem, because you just really don't see it.
Would there be a way to check that with the state of Michigan as to how many houses in Clawson may have asked for a permit? There's no records?
Yeah, local
you
law
may-
enforcement may have some sense of the number. And we can ask about that if they've at least got a number.
So until a problem shows up, we're unaware of what's going on.
Right, essentially.
Okay.
And I would say
brings me
rural
to-
communities have been hit harder in general. Some urban communities have been hit fairly hard. But, kind of, Clawson type communities haven't been hit very hard, generally speaking, with problems. A lot of the uses kind of fly under the radar, but there are a lot of rural communities where it's kind of out of control and people are just scooping up properties, and it's kind of the Wild West in a lot of ways, and a lot of rural communities are scrambling to put regulations in place because of that.
Yeah.
Well, that leads me into one of my questions. Oh.
Jim?
Jim McHale here. Okay. Going back into your presentation under the background, just after the 72 plants for operation, you've got the statement, all plants must be grown in an enclosed locked facility, which is defined in the statute. So that means outdoor growing is prohibited.
That's right.
Okay. The next sentence, the state law does not permit communities to prohibit registered primary caregivers. Now, example, what if we had the whole second block of Elmwood just across from the park as caregivers? So that is permissible then?
Sure. Yeah. You can have as many of them lined up on a street as.
It's not preventable at this point. Yeah.
Yeah.
So in other words, we couldn't set in place that there can be no caregiver within a certain distance or radius of another?
You could.
Because
And
we're only 2.5 square miles.
well,
I
no,
mean,
it's
The
not so
problem
much
is-
from each other. It's more from certain facilities, schools.
that too, right, that too.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if we can do that with primary caregiver. Well, no, we can.
Yeah,
But the
because
problem-
worst case scenario is they buy the whole second block of Elmwood and we've got a regular business going there.
Yeah, that's one of, I was just talking about how bad it's been for some rural communities. There literally are instances where people have just bought up 10, 20, 30 properties and just used all of them, for this purpose. And, it's,
That's
you don't
why
have
from
a
a
lot of
legal
vacancy.
standpoint,
So, I don't worry about that too much, but it is, I guess, a hypothetical that could occur.
Yeah, I mean, I think,
right.
Joe, to your point earlier, that the home prices probably preclude that. People buying up that many homes for that purpose, for only that. So I don't think that's something that necessarily needs to be, weighing on your mind that that's going to happen tomorrow. But I do
I was
think it's
just
worth,
thinking ahead, trying to prevent it, that's all.
right. And so I think if we think about, well, if we don't want them in the residential neighborhoods, and that's why we brought this language to you, where might it be appropriate, kind of a parallel track, if you will, to the other cannabis ordinances that we've been talking about.
Right.
But instead of, whereas that one would be allowing things that aren't currently allowed, this would be redirecting where things are already allowed, if that makes sense.
Right, that way we have some control on it.
Right. I mean, you've got them anyway. So it looked like Ed maybe had a question.
Go ahead, Ed.
Yes, thank you. At this point in time, based on my long history of group meetings, I think it might be appropriate to suggest that each commissioner be allowed to state what their questions are, and then allow the planners / city attorney to kind of take those questions and give answers. And I guess because I think before I would be able to do something in assistance to this commission with respect to where do we go next, I think we need to know where we can go, and that's going to be answering these questions and then setting a legal statement as to whether or not there's already case law that says that Ed's idea number 3 is not acceptable based on what the planners in the legal profession that help us already know.
Good point.
So I could go first if somebody wanted to say, or do we want to just continue free flow? Because I don't know, I don't think anybody could take notes on what we just had in the last fruitful discussion. Because I think it was more like a learning scenario for all of us.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good idea. If just we want to go commissioner by commissioner and each person throws out their questions, we can, I mean, some of them we might be able to just address, but we could give you like we could sort of treat it like an FAQ. These are the questions that were asked and we'll answer each one of them in a kind of memo format. I think that's kind of an interesting idea.
Yeah.
The only thing I can say about that is some discussion prompts more question from me,
Sure.
And I would agree, and we don't have to necessarily make this a one-time around,
Right.
You
This is
don't necessarily lose your turn once it's passed you. So,
right.
But on the other hand, there's probably some things that we say, hey, this is enough questions. Let's get some answers so we can narrow down the focus, and then bring all the other people's questions in after we get some answers, because some things might become against the advice of the attorney based upon what we said. And then we might have to say, okay, well, I can't do that, but maybe I can do something else that would get me either close or accomplish the same thing without being, legally challenged. I guess everything will be challenged, but I mean, without being risky, without doing something that we already know the answer is no, something like that.
Sure.
Well, Jim McHale here. This is really kind of a brainstorming session in essence. And when we're face to face, we do have very good discussions, and a lot more material comes out, just as Aaron kind of mentioned, during the discussion. Another question that she came up with on that, but that's the advantages of the face-to-face where you do interact a lot better than just zooming in. But this is at the brainstorming beginning right now, in my opinion. And correct me if I'm wrong on that, Joe, Jill.
No, it is.
Well, this is a learning process for all of us. So,
Yes, it is. I guess if you want us to make a motion on, I think I would tend to let's ask our legal advisor to give us a list of what can and can't be done. That's a primary point to me. There's so many things that we can discuss. If we like this, we don't like that, but we don't know where the
but
law.
can we do it? Yeah.
Yeah, we have to know where the law stands on it. So if we can have Renus weigh in on this and perhaps be at our next meeting to talk through it. It's
I agree with you on that, Greg.
It's a scary subject in my opinion.
So if you provided some of the ordinances that you've drafted, because those have already been vetted, would that help provide a kind of a guideline for questions? And
Somewhat, but most of what we've been dealing with are dealing with dispensaries in commercial properties. Moving into a caretaker or caregiver in a residential property, it's a different ball of wax.
Yeah, and I think the point that we're trying to make is that that's already permitted, and you already have likely many, I don't know how many, but at least several of these already operating in the community. So we're not allowing that through this language or doing anything to further encourage or allow residential uses like this. The intent of this was to say, here's what's happening in the communities. Here's some of the negative impacts of it. Does the Planning Commission want to continue discussing and exploring how to move these uses that need to be permitted? We can't outlaw them out of the residential areas and into another part of the city that's not residential. That's the primary question. And how we do that, we can get into later. So really it's do we just kind of like keep things as they are as the status quo because it doesn't seem to be a problem right now, which is also fair, or consider how we might be addressing this in another way?
Yep. So if Joan go and then Aaron.
oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to take my hand down, but I guess that was my question, was about looking at some of the draft ordinances that you've done. And again, back to the business areas where it could be allowed. Is there a square footage of building? Is there a number of caregivers that can grow in one place? And those are the other regulations. So it's not just residential.
Right.
Sure. Yeah, we do have some information on the square footages that you need for one of these operations if you're growing all 72 plants and stuff like that.
Anyone else weigh in?
Like, yeah, Aaron's got her hand up.
Yeah, I have sorry, Ed, I know that you were trying to avert these, but so my thoughts on this, and I'm only speaking from the top of my head here. I'm just wondering, should we, impose these on, let's say, an industrial? What effect would that have in compounding that with what might happen in the ballot come July? What is it, July or August? That I'm just wondering, let's say that we zone them for only industrial or whatever, and then we have all the other provisions that come into place. Then I just don't know what the ramifications of that might be. Does that mean that all industrial might be overtaken by caregiver and whatever it is that the city of Clawson votes into effect? And do you guys have experience in this type of unique situation where we're still trying to muddle through both caregiver and, this, these centers that we're still trying to figure out? Was that clarification enough in my question? Okay.
Yeah, fair question. I mean, I think I even mentioned it in the memo. Yeah. If you move these out of residential districts, you're probably moving into the same place these other uses are going to wind up in. So yeah, you kind of do have to think about the overall effect on those districts. And
but there we can say we can have limits between distances between uses. So if we said, if you're a primary caregiver, you couldn't be within however many feet of another primary caregiver or any other cannabis facility licensed by the state of Michigan. So that whatever that ended up being.
Can we say that vice versa? Like, can we regulate?
Yeah.
The last thing, can we regulate the other side with the caregiver? Let's say we have caregivers established. Are we able to say, hey, you voted this into effect, but you can't be 6 of them within, this many square miles of one another? Are we able to do that on both sides?
If this, potentially. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
The only issue would be that if, for example, and I don't remember, Joe, you might, if you've got the ballot language, I don't remember what the number of licenses are with either of those, and I apologize for not having that pulled up.
it depended on the initiative. The two initiatives had fairly different
yeah. But say, for example, I don't want to throw out a bad number. So if there were, whatever the number is, if you end up creating the barriers to effectively not allow the number that the ordinance says that you would allow because you've zoned it so in a difficult way that there are no properties available to accommodate all the licenses that would be permitted by the ordinance, that's a problem. So we'd have to kind of look at that. Does that make sense?
Exactly. You can't effectively zone them out.
Right. So like if the ordinance said that there would be 10 and you create you can't be more than 1,000 feet from all of the things that we want to keep them from, also 1,000 feet from each other and other uses, then we might be in a spot where we don't have very many parcels available. So we just have to kind of watch that.
So they don't recognize caregivers in that as an established facility, I guess. So let's say you're saying we can't regulate in that way I'm not trying to zone people out, but let's say we have 6 caregivers established in an industrial. And for example, we'll say we have 5 that were voted in to allow for retail or grow or whatever. Because we only have 6 established, they're not going to recognize those caregivers as anything in that ordinance. Like they don't even recognize them as cannabis facilities at all to meet any of that criteria?
I probably would defer to the city attorney on that answer, but I think probably not. I think that they're permitted by 2 different state acts as well. So we don't have just one comprehensive set of cannabis regulations in the state. We've got multiple regulations because they were all done at different times. To each one taking a little bit. It was like baby step here, baby step there, another bigger step. So now we've got all these kind of they're not conflicting, but necessarily, but they don't all fit neatly together.
Well, and that in lies my main concern is that before you know it, that could take over everything, right? Because there's so many different pieces of it that everybody wants a piece, and then before you know it, it's all the whole city, right? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, right. And I think, clearly that's why we're talking about this, because we don't want that to happen. We want to try and get ahead of this. And as Joan mentioned, and as Joe mentioned, we know that there are some people that are interested in property and putting these in, and we don't really have any other provisions for that at the moment.
Yeah. Regarding the other facilities permitted under the other laws, I just looked at the initiatives.
Good.
One of them allows 2 establishments and the other one allows 27. So pretty different, pretty different numbers.
Well, and I just have to say, this is one also is community based and more of a small business based from what I can take in from these local growers, seem more small business, where when I've done my research in the past, a lot of these bigger facilities are not necessarily even in state. So I don't want to discourage the small business aspect in the local caregivers, but I'm not sure how to facilitate mincing both of them without harming the caregivers, because those are the small businesses that we want to nurture. And they're our local people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else wish to opine? I'm going to go back to, I think we need more legal input on it. If there's any way you can give us a list of what we can do and a list of what we cannot do, that might be easier to look at it. And we're obviously going to have a couple more meetings on this before we carve anything in stone.
Yeah, I think we need to get together with Rennis.
Yeah.
And we can bring him some of the other language that we've worked on, kind of go through, workshop that a little bit, and kind of give you some something to think about at the next, maybe the next meeting or maybe the meeting after that. I guess we'll have to see when we can get together with him.
And we might bring it to Scott Cervello's attention too, as chief of police, see if he has any.
Yes.
Yeah.
And we've been
talked
talking to
about
him
it.
about it quite a bit. Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chair?
Sure.
Just add, in my convoluted mind, I won't be able to go on unless I give you my list of questions, because they'll come up next time and I don't know if they'll be answered. So can I do that?
You can do that, or if you want to send them to us, you can do that as well.
Oh, I wasn't good enough to write them down yet.
Okay.
Okay, go for it.
If you can keep it under half an hour, go ahead.
Oh, it'd be a couple of minutes.
Okay.
There was an initial statement that said owner occupied business. What was that statement? And what do we have in the city of Clawson for homeowner occupied business regulations?
Sure. Okay. We do have a set of home occupation regulations in the zoning ordinance, so we can
okay. So
outline that for you.
if we said that an amendment to that home occupation ordinance would be that this primary caregiver on a registered R1, R2 parcel cannot be more than 2. And can we make it in the regulation, or is it this home occupation scenario that says that that has to be your legal residence? If you're a primary caregiver,
No.
No. And the state says they can have 5, right?
Plus
They
their
can go
own.
for up to 5 patients plus themselves. Yeah.
Right.
well,
And it
no,
doesn't matter if you are a home, if you own the home or you rent the home.
well,
Not under the state law, no.
okay, but that's your legal residence. Your state ID, your license, everything says that I live at this address.
Yeah.
And that way it would be a home occupation. Otherwise,
No, it's
Correct.
primary
You're-
residence, right?
primary
It doesn't have to be their
residence.
Yeah. I don't think
Yeah,
it
I
has to
mean-
be their primary.
You want it to be their homestead property, basically, where they're paying their homestead taxes.
Yeah, you don't want an empty house that they're just occupying, yeah.
But
Yeah, exactly. That's what you're trying to.
That does happen in some communities. I think,
So that's my question, can we say that the primary caregiver can operate under the restrictions of a primary caregiver? Up to 2 can be at a primary R1, R2 residence, but it must be their, and maybe that's a great thing to say, there must be their homestead residence. And then we could say that in terms of, and then my other question is in the other districts, with respect to these condominiums, can we say that the condominium on a single parcel, registered parcel for tax ID, if there's more than 3, can we establish that as a grow facility? So if I was if 2 people came together, just like 2 people could come together in a R1, R2, then they could be primary caregivers. You get to 3, 4, 5, then can we say that should be treated as a grow facility?
I think that you just would only allow 1.
Mhm.
I don't think you would ever want a scenario where you had 12.
Well, I understand your question, though. The thing
You were
is,
saying,
the
you were
grow
talking about,
facilities are a separate license under state law.
yes,
So I think if you had an aggregation of caregivers, state law wouldn't recognize them as a grow facility. So it's hard for us to recognize them as a grow facility because we're trying to track with state law and our local regulations. Does that make sense?
absolutely not. But I'm not a lawyer.
Well, we're fighting federal law in the meanwhile anyway.
It's an extremely complicated topic.
I'm trying just to go for something that the Westgate property as a store goes to poot, okay? And somebody comes in and buys it and says, oh, I got all these little individual stores. And okay, so store number 1 is 5 primary caregivers, and store number 2 is 5 primary caregivers. And then all of a sudden you have a single tax ID under operating behind the books as a grow facility.
Sure. So you're saying if the whole shopping center went to condo and each unit got its own tax ID number?
Well, no, right now,
Okay.
right now that's considered as one facility. If we
Right.
have when we've done the Westgate Shopping Center and somebody does something different that has to have a planning or a zoning, we treat it as it's the facility. We don't treat it as an individual.
It's a zoning lot. It's a zoning lot. And you can, if you said, we did this in Lathrop Village where we said you need to have, I think it's 750 square feet per caregiver, but no more than 2 caregivers per premises.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's what I was getting at.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes,
And
you can
that
do
would
that
be-
there. Right,
that
but
would
we
be
wouldn't want
in-
to do that in the residential neighborhood because
No, I separated that.
okay, good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do in a residential, but I think that more than 2
Yeah.
on a residential partial is not residential, and I think we ought to
more
treat
than
it as
one
a
is
home
not.
occupation,
Yeah.
which means that it's actually your home, the place, the place where you watch TV and go to bed.
Right.
Yep.
So some of those questions that from your planning experience and or the attorney's experience would be very helpful to be clarified as part of what I think Greg said, that we need to know what we can and can't do, where
know,
are our
and
boundaries.
And we because this is a complex topic, we brought you sort of a brief overview just to get the ball rolling and get you thinking, because if we brought you too much, then it would be overwhelming and it's hard to get through it all. So I think this was a good first run through, and we get a kind of a feel for what your questions are. So we can come back with some other things. And I will try to get that list of the things that you can't do, which I think the things that you can, will probably, the things that you can't do are probably a lot longer than the list of things that you can do, but.
I would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, this has been a good talking meeting here. I think we got some ideas across. Another way of looking at that's confusing to me, if I were owning a dispensary, it would make sense to me because I could grow a whole bunch of marijuana and I could have a whole bunch of customers coming in. Now, if I'm a primary caregiver, my list of customers is very limited.
Right.
I'm not going to get the volume of people coming and going, and I'm not going to have the money to buy the equipment. I would see where it's two different games here. So I think there are some limitations as to how many people would consider going into this caregiving business when it's so readily available through dispensaries.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think in the long term, that's a major consideration.
Why would you make your own whiskey if you can go to the party store and buy a fifth? I mean, that's
yeah, exactly. It's a very good question. It's a question I've asked every time I've talked to people who are in this business. And there is a possibility that the bigger players are ultimately going to basically make all these caregivers disappear.
Yeah.
It might take a while, but it may just not be worth it to be in the caregiver business, after a certain point. And, ultimately, there's a chance that the state government will look at all this, look at the landscape and say, all right, we need one law that governs all of this instead of 3 laws that don't work together governing it. That might be wishful thinking. I don't know, but hopefully someday we will actually get to a point where we just have the one law, and that'll simplify everything. Because right now we have to talk about them all in silos.
Right.
Well, I think that Greg is lots of loopholes, where you see people take of different situations, and what can caregivers offer? Stronger strains, different loopholes for these big companies to, quite frankly, take advantage of in ways that is not helping our community or helping, small business in any way. And that's just my opinion. So I think that, what Jill was saying, all these different laws, there's so many loopholes that there's so many ways in and out and to get around things. So that's what obviously we can't take away all of that or much of that because we can't even foresee that. But I appreciate the discussion very much, Jill and Joe.
Yes, I think it's very well done. Anybody else want to weigh in before we move along on our agenda? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to item C, the master plan update.
So
I can run with that if you'd like.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Was it last week that we had the open house or 2 weeks ago? It was 2 weeks ago, wasn't it? It was.
It was. It was 2 weeks ago.
So 2 weeks ago, we had an open house to share sort of the progress and the reasons for doing the master plan amendment. We had participation from several planning commissioners and a couple members from council, so we appreciate that. Otherwise, we had probably, I would say about 20 members of the community that were there at different times. And I think the conversations were good. We kept the information available on the city's website, and I had hoped that we might get a few more responses from that, but we haven't so far. So maybe we can, with Nick's help, maybe we can push that out one more time to see if we can get anybody interested in participating in the survey. But I think probably at our next meeting, we'll bring some more work for us to discuss.
Okay. Very good, thank you. Should we move on to item number 7, the planner's report?
Yes, so I guess one of the big things in our report that we have to discuss with the Planning Commission is
You may ask Mr. McHale if he knows what the next topic is.
yeah, this date. So the Planning Commission can return to meeting in chambers as of July 13th. You do not have to, but we should take a poll of planning commissioners and see what your feelings are on moving back to in-person meetings as of the next meeting, which is July 13th.
You could start with me.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's take it away, Jim.
Oh, I say yes.
Can we just do a roll call on this?
I think that's probably the most constructive way to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree.
So a yes will be return in person and a no will be stay virtual. Nick, do you want to call the roll there?
Yeah, of course. Mr. Sanaki,
Yes.
Mr. Georges,
Yes.
Mr. Cusero,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Mr. Nishai,
Yes.
Mr. Pernick,
Yes, but with a question.
Okay.
The question is, I don't know if our I don't know if it's our enactment ordinance or our charter permits attending at a distance virtually. And just, because it's summer, it's not, in an effort. I don't personally have the concerns that I had 6 months ago about appearing in person in chambers. But are we able to participate remotely?
There will be a hybrid option for the foreseeable future. Yes.
Okay. So yes, I haven't changed my question or my response.
Okay. Nick, take it away.
and then Ms. Redmond.
Yes, I would love to meet you all finally, face to face, after a year.
Good.
So that's 7-0. Obviously, we have 2 commissioners missing. I know one of them would be an 8-0. So it sounds like the Planning Commission would like to return to meeting in chambers as of July 13th. As I said, there will be a virtual option for the foreseeable future. I don't know exactly how long that will last. That's probably something that needs to be worked out among city administration and council. But yeah, there will be a remote attendance option for a while, at least. So I guess we will look at seeing you all in person in July.
So this is solid, not just a tentative date?
No, this is solid. Yeah, you guys basically just voted to have an in-person meeting in July.
Music to my ears.
Anything else, Joe?
Nothing else from the planner's report tonight, no.
Well, maybe you could answer it, or I know Joan's still on here. Any word from the Church of Clawson as to when we might see them?
Joan, what's the last thing you heard?
I thought they might be here at this meeting, but I really do anticipate it's going to be soon. That's what they had just 3 things to address, and they were being helped with those. So I'm hoping soon.
Good. So the city's still talking with them and.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We are hand holding.
Very good. Thank you.
Quick question.
Sure. George?
What about Clausen Grill? What's happening there?
I have no idea, George. She's not shared any of her plans with the city.
Okay, that'll be done with the planner's report. How about staff report and training opportunities?
Well, you've got things in the monthly report for training. Also, we do have a couple business things that you might like to know. We have a couple business expansions, which is Pot Pies on West 14 Mile is expanding into a second space. Downtown Charlie's is expanding into the Froze building adjacent to them. And flip side is now staying through Christmas. So that's very nice to hear. And they are still actively looking for a place in Clausen. So keep your eyes open. Old Port has put in a new door, which is allowing them to service a patio that they're putting out for the summer. So that's another good thing. And that's all I've got.
Do they have enough room there for a patio?
Yeah, they actually do. There is a short sidewalk there that runs in front of the building.
Yeah.
But they've added a wood platform to extend out and stay even with the concrete. And it takes it out to the parking bumpers that are there. So there's actually quite a good amount of space there.
Yeah, there's decent clearance there.
Yeah.
Very good.
In your packet, there was a flyer from Michigan State University Extension on capital asset management and planning, CIPs. Of course, we'll be talking about that and having a training locally later in the summer. But if anybody's interested in that, that we did include the info on that in your packet. And then we also put the Michigan Municipal League Conference postcard in there as well. We don't generally see planning commissioners go to the MML conference. We see them go to the Michigan Association of Planning conference more often. Jill, have you heard whether or not MAP is going to be in person this year?
I believe it's still going to be virtual.
Okay. So you may be able to attend that one from the comfort of your couch.
Right. Yeah, I've seen a couple of those.
Yeah.
Okay, for legal update, I don't see Rennes here, so am I to assume we have no legal update?
No, we were not provided with one.
Okay, so anyone have any final comments before I ask for someone to make a motion that we adjourn? If there are no comments, I'll entertain an adjournment motion.
I'll make a motion that on the floor for accepting the regular meeting or ending the regular meeting of the Planning Commission for Tuesday, June 22nd, 2021. This is for an adjournment.
I'll second.
I have a motion. I have support. Can I have roll call, please?
Mr. Georges,
Yes.
Mr. Cusero,
Yes.
Mr. McHale,
Yes.
Mr. Nushai,
Yeah.
Mr. Pernick,
Yes.
Ms. Redmond,
Yes.
Mr. Sanaki.
Yes.
Meeting's